Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tabby, and I'm the Director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity and Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, as well as a Professor of Education and Psychology here at the University of Michigan. Thank you for joining us for this event on academic freedom and responsibility in a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive campus community. Closed captioning is available. Click on the CC icon and select View Subtitle, and this session is being recorded. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially as a gift through the treaty at the foot of the rapids. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. As a faculty member who has benefited from and advocated for the tenets of academic freedom, and as a faculty member who has been engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, work for my entire career, I have a great appreciation of why today's discussion is particularly important and especially current, relevant, and necessary. The principle of academic freedom, without a doubt, is core and foundational to institutions of higher education since their inception, which have served as bedrocks for the free expression of ideas and innovation that reflect the values of a democratic society. Academic freedom is a core feature of the work that faculty members have dedicated their lives and careers to. In the last few years, we have seen academic freedom called into question, not only at the University of Michigan, but nationally. Like you, or like many of you, I can think of a number of recent incidents in which challenges to academic freedom has sparked national and local conversations and debate. For example, the current wave of legislative actions across the country challenging faculty members' ability to disseminate their work publicly, and bans against what is being called critical race theory, or quote unquote, the teaching of divisive concepts around race and sexual orientation within classrooms. And these challenges are both in the pre-K to 12 education system, as well as in higher education, including proposed steps to eliminate tenure. While threats to academic freedom are not a new phenomenon, arguably the recent challenges and controversies related to academic freedom in the classroom are due to the fact that we are in a critical moment of political and social change. In recent decades, campuses and classrooms have become more diverse. And over the past few years in particular, we have paid attention to social inequalities of many types, both induced and exacerbated by the pandemic. And there's been new and renewed attention to systemic racism sparked by highly publicized police violence, such as the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. These conditions have amplified the pervasive structural racism and other social inequalities that continue to plague our society. And we are at an interesting space in our society right now, where there is both increased awareness of systemic inequality and calls for eradicating it, and an increased focus on denying systemic inequality as evidenced by these increasing waves of, quote, anti-divisive concepts legislation. This dynamic, these interactions between academic freedom, a diversifying student body, and a fraught and divisive societal context have presented challenges, and I would also say opportunities. Students want to talk about these current societal issues on campus and in the classroom, and often demand it. And as much as we as faculty members may wish to also address these issues in the classroom, teaching content related to diversity, equity, and inclusion demands a particular set of skills. And these competencies are particularly important in the current moment. With academic freedom comes academic responsibility in order to ensure that complex content is presented through inclusive pedagogy that promotes positive learning environments, including rigorous debate around diverse perspectives. This moment has encouraged many of us to re-examine our curriculum, our teaching, and our interactions with students. Important to note as we proceed, academic and free speech and free expression have at times been mistakenly conflated, and the differences and the relationship are important to note. Academic freedom allows faculty to engage around ideas and knowledge production unimpeded, and allows faculty to dictate what they include in curriculum and how to teach content. But academic freedom does not give faculty members protection to make disparaging comments against certain communities and groups, and when challenged to say that it's acceptable practice because of academic freedom. There is a difference, and it's important for that to be acknowledged, especially for this conversation that we're having today. I would also like to note that some have pitted academic freedom against DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion, but this is a false dichotomy, and I would push for our academy not to fall into this trap of oversimplification. In fact, academic freedom and DEI go hand in hand. Both are core concepts in academia, and one should not be valued over the other. I would assert, for instance, that without academic freedom, the wealth of research that we have on DEI-related topics would not be possible. I would also say that the conversations, debates, and disagreements about DEI issues in our society have been the impetus to new bodies of research and forms of knowledge production. These are hard and complicated conversations. And as a University of Michigan community, we need to have these discussions to work through how we exercise academic freedom and responsibility in this current socio-political climate as a part of working toward being a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive campus. We are grateful for our panel today. They represent a range of expertise, experiences, and perspectives. And I'm grateful for their willingness to engage in this tough conversation here. During our time together, our panelists will delve into principles of academic freedom and DEI, with a special focus on the classroom context. At the end of the discussion, we hope to talk specifically about what U of M has and what is needed to move forward. We are also grateful for you, those of us who have joined us today for this webinar, and we are eager to hear your ideas about how we can continue the conversation and actions after this event. Before we get started, I want to thank the staff at the National Center for Institutional Diversity, or NCID, and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for their thoughtful vision and planning for the event, their logistical and access support, and support of our scholar panel and community. I also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Senate Advisory Committee on University Affairs, or SACUA, and the Democracy and Debate Program. Before I turn it over to Lynette Clemetson, who is the director of the Wallace House and who will moderate our discussion, I would like to introduce Provost Susan Collins. In addition to serving as the university's Chief Academic and Budget Officer, she holds faculty appointments in the Ford School of Public Policy and the Department of Economics. Her scholarly work focuses on understanding and improving living standards in countries at all levels of development. And after the panel presentation, Rob Sellers, our Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer, will provide concluding thoughts. I will now turn the virtual podium over to Provost Collins. Susan.
Tabby, thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be here for this important event this afternoon. I'd like to join you to start out by thanking the offices and the programs that have organized and are sponsoring today's panel. Thank you very much. And I also want to express my appreciation to the panelists for participating in today's discussion and offering their thoughts and perspectives on what we know is a complex topic. And a special thanks as well to Lynette Clemetson for moderating what I expect will be a very vigorous discussion. And that's important as well. The foundation of universities like Michigan is a commitment to inquiry, to expanding the scope of human knowledge in every domain. And so we're committed to the principle of academic freedom. This encompasses opportunities to both explore ideas and also to discuss them fully, recognizing that some of these ideas will be controversial, perhaps very much so. Universities are committed to both dimensions of academic freedom, in other words, exploring and discussing ideas, because we believe that it serves society. In that context, Harold Shapiro, who was president of the university in the 1980s, has noted that the role of the university is to stand at an angle to society, to be a thoughtful critic of the present, and to engage in shaping society for the future. We're also committed to our values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In particular, the University of Michigan must be a place where people from different backgrounds and perspectives can learn and thrive. To achieve this, we work continuously to create an environment in which people are not disparaged because of who they are, and ideas are not discounted because of who articulates them. Too often, these commitments of academic freedom and inclusion are set in opposition to one another, as Tabby also mentioned. However, both commitments are fundamental to our mission of academic excellence. We must work together to support an environment that protects free speech while recognizing that this can create unequal burdens and that continuing our collective work to nurture a culture of inclusion matters. Endorsing both commitments should open the door to more inquiry, discussion, and learning. And this type of nuanced, engaged discussion is really a key goal for our panel session today. To fulfill our responsibilities to these commitments, we must ask probing questions and see where they lead us. The inclusion of more voices and different perspectives in recent years has led to new questions and to the opening of new ideas of inquiry. This diversity is a critical contribution to the excellence of contemporary higher education. It leads us to reconsider ideas that many may have previously accepted and to explore alternative explanations and perspectives. This isn't easy work. People often have very strongly held views and beliefs, and they often find it hard to be open to other viewpoints. So inquiry and its exculpation can be difficult because, as Tabby noted, we live in a divided society at a time where there is considerable change. History tells us that such periods bring disagreements to the forefront. And in this context, it's important to recognize that academic freedom is rooted in our striving for excellence. Its focus is rigorous inquiry and thoughtful consideration. And it's not a license for expounding unfounded opinions or disparaging others or their ideas. As members of the academic community, we have an important role to play in helping society navigate the challenges that are before us, and a responsibility to ensuring that freedom of inquiry is secure and that discussion and debate is thoughtful and respectful, an opportunity to learn for all who are involved. So ensuring in particular that students have opportunities like these will help prepare them for whatever they choose in life. It'll also prepare them for citizenship in a diverse and rapidly changing world, for what Michelle Obama has called the call and response of democracy. So thank you for the opportunity to make some initial remarks. It's now my pleasure to turn the virtual microphone over to Lynette Clemetson, who will begin our panel discussion. Lynette.
Thank you so much for those wonderful introductions, Provost Collins and Tabby, and for the context we need for a conversation like this one today. I want to jump in and introduce our panelists. As Susan mentioned, I think this is going to be a lively conversation and with a lot of context and nuance. And we want to welcome your input as well. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A box. We'll be monitoring your questions throughout the conversation. I'll both weave them in the middle of the conversation, and also we'll make specific time for Q&A at the end of our group conversation. I'm going to introduce our panelists now in alphabetical order. Joining us today are Naomi Andre, Professor of Afro-American and African Studies and Women's and Gender Studies, Associate Director for Faculty of the Residential College and Associate Director of the African Studies Center. Paul Courant, the Edward M. Gramlich Distinguished University Professor Emeritus of Economics and Public Policy, the Harold T. Shapiro Collegiate Professor of Public Policy Emeritus, and Arthur F. Thurnow Professor Emeritus. Sean Johnson, Assistant Professor of Astronomy and LSA Collegiate Fellow. Whitney Peoples, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the School of Public Health. And Kentaro Toyama, the W.K. Kellogg Professor of Community Information and Professor of Information in the School of Information. Thank you all for joining us and for bringing your expertise and your views to this conversation. And I so appreciated both Tabby and Susan's opening remarks, because when I started thinking about the questions that we would discuss, the issues that we would discuss for this conversation, I kept thinking about what is academic freedom? And if we asked 12 people what academic freedom is, we might get 12 different definitions. And so to have some context from them, and also some direction that for a conversation like this, we want to make sure that we're not conflating academic freedom with some other concepts, and that academic freedom requires rigor and honesty and accountability. And so with those framing points of context for our discussion, I want to start with Kentaro, as we recognize that this issue of academic freedom, while it feels very current and in the press right now, this is a conversation and a debate that's been going on for quite some time. And so Kentaro, can you start off by talking about how academic freedom has been impacted both by history and by current events?
Thank you, Lynette. I'll mention that, by the way, I'm president of a newly revived chapter of the Ann Arbor Association of American University Professors, and that, and I'm also a member of SACIO, and I'm not speaking for either group, but a lot of what I will say is informed by work with those two groups. Academic freedom actually has a fairly well-defined set of things. It involves freedom with respect to research and publication, freedom with respect to what and how we teach, freedom to speak publicly as citizens, and ultimately freedom also to comment on the way that the university is run. And those things are actually in the faculty handbook, for example, that the Provost office maintains based on a Senate Assembly motion that happened in 2010. And I added a link to that in the chat. Now, as Lynette, you mentioned, sometimes academic freedom is conflated with other things like US First Amendment free speech. And they're not exactly the same, but there is a significant amount of overlap. And I wanted to mention that one of the things I think that's happening right now, especially in the United States, is that there's a generational shift that I think is still underway, in which the way that people perceive the phrase free speech has changed. So for example, in the 60s and 70s, you know, it was often people on the left fighting for free speech because, you know, due to McCarthyist stifling of anything that was remotely considered supporting communism, there was a pushback against that to really enable more political speech by, you know, everybody, and especially on university campuses. And of course, you know, we're not necessarily in a university context, you know, going to be able to change how the United States perceives free speech. But one related aspect of that is I think there's a similar generational reconsideration of, you know, what a university should do with respect to academic freedom. And one thing that I have run into recently with work that seems seemingly very disconnected to this topic with respect to graduate student mental health is that arguably a lot of the culture and tradition of universities today was, you know, was formalized and established in a time that was much less diverse and arguably focused on a more privileged class of people in higher education. And I think one thing about that is that that history is so subtle that we don't actually notice it in our culture at the university. And so there are things that we still do habitually at university that we don't give a second thought to because we think that's the way it's always been done, which arguably are long overdue for recalibration and reconsideration.
That's a great place to bring Whitney into the conversation, because we are, as the definition has changed culturally across the country, things have also shifted in universities. The country's become more diverse, is becoming more diverse year by year, and universities are becoming more diverse. And so Whitney, you know, this is your area of expertise. You train people in how to deal with increased diversity in an academic higher education setting. Can you talk about how diversification has impacted how people think about the notion of academic freedom, and how you can articulate the relationship between these two concepts for people who are wrestling with how to move through this more diverse world?
Absolutely. I mean, I think as we, you know, see the demographics of universities changing, as we see more BIPOC, as we see you know, more women, as we see more LGBTQ folk, right? As we see a range of people gain access to this space, it brings different voices, different viewpoints, different priorities and needs into the space. And so there's some competition, right? And in a place like higher education that really relies quite a bit on hierarchy, that competition enters into the existing hierarchies of this space, right? And so it does, in fact, create some conflict and resistance. But I think even, right, I mean, some of those demographic gains are not as large as we would want them to be, right? We still see underrepresentation of BIPOC, right, of a range of historically marginalized and minoritized groups in higher education. And so even where those numbers have not moved, the national, cultural, and political conversation has moved. So you now have students entering the university with an entirely different frame of reference and an entirely different vocabulary. And because of that, a different set of expectations. So where some students might have had to wait until they got to college to encounter such social justice frameworks or feminist frameworks, right? Lots of folks are entering college now having encountered that in a range of spaces outside of school, on TikTok, right? On Instagram, right? And I mean, lots of amazing, amazing content that really serves a pedagogical function. And so students walk into the classroom really with a different set of values and expectations about what the classroom should look like and feel like, what they expect from their instructors. And I think that's a big part of this, right? That leads to students offering critique, to pushing back, to asking questions. And I think something that Tabby said for me is just really key for thinking about that relationship between DEI and academic freedom. With academic freedom comes academic responsibility. And with academic responsibility comes accountability, right? And so if you imagine academic freedom as being beyond accountability, right, as the absence of critique or the absence of pushback, then when you encounter this shift, what Kentaro called this generational shift, where folks are raising critiques, right? They're asking questions, they're pushing back, they're wanting a different kind of engagement, that might feel very quickly like an attack on academic freedom. It is not, right? It is actually a kind of inquiry, right? It's an opportunity to engage, to have conversations. I think academic freedom and DEI are really in a symbiotic relationship. Some of the core concepts of DEI work, I think, for example, of Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality, right, come straight out of scholarly production, right? So academic freedom is a necessity for critical DEI work, and DEI work not as a kind of policing force, right, to rap people on the knuckles when they've done something wrong, but DEI work is really a creative, productive movement that moves higher education forward, that keeps us relevant, and that allows us to do that work, right, of being able to engage and move society forward in ways that are ethical, that are sustainable, and that are just.
And I want to bring Paul in next. You know, you mentioned so many interesting things, Whitney, about, of course, higher ed is a place where actually the goal of higher ed is to produce critical thinkers, people who feel confident and well-informed to challenge authority, challenge social norms. And yet it is a different, it has created a different kind of culture for many people in academia. Paul, how have you seen this culture shift? And how do you discuss in your work how to keep people from conflating what is a normal challenge to authority and to types of thinking broadly about ideas, with thinking that this is in some way policing or something that is confining academic freedom?
So just want to briefly go back to defining academic freedom, which we're going to, I think, loop around in a variety of ways here. And then I will talk a little bit about some classroom experiences I've had that I think are relevant. But you know, I want to make academic freedom a really simple idea, oversimplified, right? Academics often oversimplify things. It's the freedom to be an academic, to do what academics do, to follow ideas and knowledge and interpretations that are part of learning and teaching. So that's a lot of freedom, right? And it's easy, I think, to think that that's a license to do anything you want. It totally can't be. The academy establishes rules and norms in the interest of learning and teaching. That's academic freedom, but that's risky. That can sometimes be harmful. And in order to have the accountability part go with the freedom part, we have to be open to discussion and examination of why academic freedom is a good idea, not just for us, for academics. Yeah, we like it, but actually for the world as a whole. And what I've found in the last, so I've been teaching at this university for 40 odd years. And this change, a great deal of this change has happened during this time. The last course I taught before getting all those emeritus titles, which basically mean you don't have to do anything, but they also don't pay you. So it's not that great. It's great. But the last course I taught was an introduction to public policy. It was one in which one of the topics that we spent a great deal of time on was K through 12 education. And we were explicit. We knew that that was a topic that could be quite contentious and hot button for a variety of people. So we set out some norms for talking about policy that apply to policy around DEI and related areas. They could also apply to policy in other areas as well. But in the sort of area of marginalized populations, their role, their place, the way they fit into the university, the key notions that we came up with were agreement among the class in sharing responsibility for all of our work. So everybody in the room, right, is part of the academic enterprise, which requires freedom in order to learn from it. We encouraged each other to represent their own views, speak from their own experience, not sort of make up some, here's a typical case that I don't know anything about. If you're going to talk about something that you do know about, do. If you're going to talk about some other case, you have to label it as such. Listen to others' perspectives. And there's a sort of test in here. If you can restate what other people are saying without adding your own stuff, that's a sign that you're listening well, and it's a good diagnostic. And this is really important. Do not agree for the sake of agreement, right? Don't agree because that just ends the conversation well. It doesn't end the conversation well unless that agreement is around something that you've really worked on and built and can describe. And the last one is that everybody should be comfortable, should not be comfortable, but should take some risks. Make the interchange, the class, a place, the phrase we used then was brave spaces rather than safe spaces, right? Spaces in which you're really willing to get out there, discuss, learn about complex issues. And so recognizing that bringing in populations, the phrase bringing in is actually awful, but the change in who's in the university that's taken place basically over my career, that's tremendous opportunity to learn stuff that otherwise wouldn't have been known. And again, this idea that if everybody in the classroom thinks they're involved in the same learning enterprise, there does not have to be a conflict per se between academic freedom and DEI work.
Before, I want to bring in Naomi and Sean, but before we do, I want to connect two things, Paul, that something you said with something that Whitney said. In talking about how you create these brave spaces, Paul, you said a key phrase, in the classroom. And now so much of what makes this complicated links to what Whitney said. There's so many more people engaged in everything we say than the people who are in any given room with us now, because there's TikTok, there's Snapchat, there's Twitter, there are all of these other platforms that both are empowering and change the dynamics of any conversation that we think we're having in a room with norms created for that room. And so, Whitney, I'd like to just go back to you for a second to talk about how we navigate norms when the participants in the conversation are amorphous, hard to see, and changing all the time?
I think that's a great question. Thank you, Lynette. You know, I would say one of the things is to take social media into account in your norms. So name that explicitly with your students, right? To talk about, how does this leave this classroom space? Where do we want this to go? How does it travel? I think naming that really clearly is an important part. I think asking students to be thoughtful about how things will travel without context really matters. The other thing, I often see social media used by students as a way to amplify really their protest or their challenge. So when they find themselves without other opportunities to offer critique, to offer feedback, right, to engage, to really co-construct the space, co-create knowledge with faculty, with their peers, then Twitter becomes a space where they will go for affirmation and for support and for guidance on how to move through. And so I think also really trying to think about how you invite students into the space as partners in creating the classroom space, providing opportunities for them to share feedback and for that feedback to be actionable, right? For something to be done. I think that's an important piece.
Yeah.
So just a quick, I have to say, you're in territory where I don't know well how to do that, but I can see that I should know, if I knew better, I could do a better job teaching. But one thing we did do that I have done for years that I think fits in is continually asking the students, asking them online, asking them in person, so how are we doing at this project of making this feel like a collective knowledge good that we're producing that we can all share? And asking that question basically at the beginning of every class, beginning of every interchange about the previous interchange. And that at least gets you part of the way there. And I tried to play with TikTok this morning to figure out what it does and why, and not there yet.
I think we could all say similar things about every time we think we've mastered a platform, the platform changes or the way people use it change. Naomi, I want to bring you into the conversation to talk a little bit about, we can talk about our beliefs about what is academic freedom, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean, how in principle, they are not at odds, how they play out in the classroom, often though it can feel as if they're at odds. And so can you talk a little bit about how this has come up in the classroom for you, and how you've navigated when there are different forces who feel different things about who's accountable, who's responsible, what that responsibility looks like?
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And I want to sort of weave my own experiences in the classroom, as well as being a professor here. I've been here at Michigan since the late 1990s, so close to 30 years, not quite as long as former Provost Paul Courant, but I've seen a lot of changes in this classroom in this same place. And I want to talk about how such intellectual freedom that we talk about, academic freedom, it's critical to our academic environment. Rather than focusing on what is safe, popular, or familiar, the academy gives us a space where we can be courageous, as was mentioned before, brave and courageous. From my experience in classroom teaching, my work on committees, and in research, a really important part of this freedom also requires responsibility. And I'm going to talk sort of simply, like straightforwardly, about a couple of these key terms. Responsibility means providing a context, whether it's historical, situational, but a context where our intent is somewhat transparent. Why are we moving into challenging ground if we know it is controversial? My primary gauge after years of experience and thinking about these issues regarding presenting challenging and difficult material, and it's going to sound a little familiar in another context, but my primary gauge is do no harm. Harm is making someone uncomfortable in a way that goes deeper than a challenging idea. Harm hurts people's feelings and shakes their sense of feeling that they belong or are entitled to a space at the table. Harm is not an intellectual engagement, but a poisonous spear. And I'm choosing my words carefully here because a poisonous spear can create a wound that gets infected and becomes dangerous. Harm does not make you stronger. Harm can cause permanent damage. When harm is done, and we know it happens, harm can happen out of good intentions as well as happening inadvertently. We can and we do cause harm accidentally. We do this to people we know as well as to those we don't know, but might encounter in a meeting or at a classroom. Sometimes we cause harm to people we care about in our personal and professional relationships. And my feeling is that we all do this. Everyone does harm. As we're human, we sometimes cause harm. So here are a few ways that I think we can heal the wounds from that poisonous spear of harm. First, listen to make sure you understand what has caused the harm. Second, affirm that you understand. And then say that you will learn from this experience so you don't do it again. And third, apologize. Even if you did not intend to do something wrong, if someone tells you that you harmed them, it is far better to apologize than to be defensive or to not apologize. So these three things, listen, affirm, and apologize, can lead to repair. And I like this word repair because it does not carry the baggage of reparations. And reparations, we know, it's a fraught term that does a lot of good, but in the current parlance, it seems to signal a monetary payment. Repair can help heal. And I'd like to connect repair to care, not just because it rhymes, but since it moves towards a place for feeling better and for moving forward. In closing, I want to say that in a university at all levels, at the college level, the department, and the classroom, we are building communities. We do not need to like everyone. And that's just the reality of such a large institution. You don't have to like everyone. However, it is best when we can work with everyone to get our jobs done. As students, faculty, staff, and administrators, we all have jobs to do here at the University of Michigan. It is best when we can respect everyone and treat people with care. Our community works well when we have compassion, when we are generous, and when we offer forgiveness. Thank you.
Naomi, I want to ask you to just elaborate a little bit on the space between two words that you used. One is harm, whether intended or unintended, and most harm is unintended. You also use the word discomfort. And for some of the courageous exploration that both you and Paul, that everybody's talked about so far, isn't discomfort necessary? And is there, what's the space between discomfort and harm?
Yeah, I think discomfort is very necessary because it involves change to what we think is normal or what we've grown up with or what at least we're familiar with, and maybe we haven't ever questioned it. But I want to say, and I thank you for outlining, there is a space between discomfort that can lead to healthy interrogation of, what am I thinking? What's going on? Ooh, I'm not used to thinking this. And I feel absolutely obliterated and taken down. And there is a history that I'm never present in the classroom or on bookshelves, or, I don't see anyone else doing what I want to do. And to just have somebody wipe you out, that's harm. And even if the professor or the colleague is just saying something that's true, yeah, we don't see any Black women studying opera. And, how did you even get into this? And what do you know about it? I'm an opera scholar, so I hear that all the time. It's one thing, now that I've been able to prove myself to myself, like, oh yeah, actually, and some people take my ideas more seriously. That's sort of, you can challenge. And as you get more experienced in this, you get sort of tougher armor. However, when we're dealing with students and in a place that's so nurturing, like a university, we really want to be gentle. And when we're not, because we're all busy and it's gray for the umpteenth day in a row, and we are feeling unhappy, then we can misstep. We're human. But if we try to have, so to think, uh-oh, did I cross the line where some of my students, I went from discomfort to harm. It's going to be different for different people too, depending on their experiences. And so it's something where we get to recalibrate. But I like, instead of focusing on the danger, the cancel culture, and instead to say, this is a generous space. We've worked hard to get here. And there's a privilege in being here, and like it's a good thing.
Sean, if you could come in and talk about your experiences navigating these spaces in the classroom and in your work more broadly. We also have had a question from the audience, Sean, about in this area of harm and discomfort and courage, sometimes the very thing that a faculty member is pursuing in their research may be offensive to someone. And so how can you pursue, teach, publish in an area that may cross a line for some people into discomfort or harm? And I think this Tabby raised this in her comments about some of the legislation proposed now about divisive concepts, which is such a broad term. I would assume that most things that you all are pursuing could be thought of as divisive concepts in some way or another. So Sean, how do you navigate these spaces in your work?
Sure, thanks for the opportunity to talk. So I want to first sort of contextualize my experience a little bit. I arrived at the University of Michigan relatively recently. And before that, almost all of my teaching experience was in state and federal prisons, teaching college courses. And in that context, academic freedom does not exist. I could not use even things like dice and cards to teach statistics because they are literally forbidden. And this sort of makes me value academic freedom significantly. But the amplified power differential in that environment also makes me more aware of the responsibility. So in that context, a poor grade or getting kicked out of the class could have real ramifications for a student's eligibility for early parole. That is certainly more extreme than what we encounter here at the University of Michigan, but there is still a very real power gap between faculty and students. So if I am teaching a class in a way that I would argue is ineffective and causing the type of harm that Naomi mentioned, past a certain point in the semester, if a student decides that they no longer want to subject themselves to this harm, they need my permission to drop the class. That's a significant power gap. And in many cases, dropping a class can have significant financial aid impact. It's a waste of time. It shows up on your transcript. And so I think when we contextualize both academic freedom and responsibility, we have to keep in mind responsibility to our students and to recognize the power that we hold over them, both formal and sort of informal power. In terms of teaching sort of difficult concepts, this is something that might seem far afield from astronomy, which is where most of my teaching is now. But we often get and teach about data from telescopes and facilities built on indigenous land that is not just historically contested, but currently contested. My field is trying to build telescopes on Mauna Kea, for example, and it's not inconceivable that there would be a student in my class who went to a protest against the construction of that telescope. And so to me, that isn't a reason to not talk about these things. It's a reason to contextualize it, to talk about why people consider this land to be sacred, and how it is also very useful for a scientific context, and how balancing those priorities is not some set of objective questions with objective measures and answers, but a set of sort of cultural priorities with larger power dynamics from a colonial power to a colonized people.
It's so interesting. You know, you say your work now might not seem like the place that these questions come up, but in fact, one of the books that I've loved most in the past year has been a book called Disordered Cosmos, that I'm sure everybody in your particular world, it must have taken everyone by storm. And so I think that the interesting thing about scholarship is that in all of our areas, we have the opportunity, generation after generation, over and over again, to think about the norms of our areas, our expertise, think about it anew, and start new conversations that cross over into other areas of the university, which is what makes universities so rich. And certainly your experience, the experience that you bring from prisons and teaching in prisons to a university like the University of Michigan, the opportunity for students to engage with you and other faculty to engage with you about these concepts of, well, what does freedom really look like? And what does it mean in a community? Have you gotten interesting questions about what that means and how those different spaces operate?
I think the trap that we often fall into, and scientists I think are particularly prone to this, is confusing legal threats against academic freedom, so legislation, rules at an institution that threaten people's livelihoods, et cetera, versus feeling discomfort as an instructor because you've been accused of neglecting something, or even directly being accused of having done something racist or sexist. And I think one of the things that the Disordered Cosmos does particularly well, and yes, it did take my field by storm, is talking about the perspective of a current faculty member as a student and experiencing some of those sorts of power dynamics. And one of the things that I try to do when students point out that I've done or said something not great is recognize that takes significant bravery on their part. So we often talk about Twitter mobs or things like that coming for our academic freedoms or what have you, or other people talk about that. But it's worth keeping in mind that is usually a last resort, and that students only go to that sort of space when they have emailed the department chair or gone through normal channels at the university and felt unheard. And just keeping that in mind and listening more effectively is a pretty good tool pedagogically.
As I knew it would, this conversation the time's going by much too quickly for me. I want to have some time for you all to engage with one another around these concepts as well. And so I'm going to throw out one question that I would like you all to react to. What do you all need as faculty to be able to engage across these spaces more effectively? What do you need from one another? What do you need from students? What do you need from the university? Kentaro, I'll start with you and then we can popcorn around.
Right, sure, putting us on the spot. I'll say that I think there's two things that would be really helpful. And by the way, I will also say one of the great privileges of being at a large and excellent university like the University of Michigan is we do have an incredible array of resources to go to for a lot of things. I'll just mention, like, for example, in our unit, last year we had Whitney come over and run several workshops about curriculum that were extremely helpful. And that was when she was at CRLT. I'm sure CRLT still has plenty of other people and resources we can go to. But two things I think would be helpful. One is in reference to kind of brave spaces that Paul raised and we talked about, is to have something like that for faculty and staff at probably roughly the department level. Because one of the things I'm hearing from my colleagues is increasingly people on the one hand want to introduce topics that are that are advanced DEI in their classrooms, but they're afraid that one small misstep will land them in some Twitter storm outside. And the ability to talk about these things among faculty and staff and just make sure everything that you might do in a classroom is okay and healthy and won't result in too much harm to anybody, I think is worth doing at again probably at the size of roughly the department level. And then the second thing is I love what Naomi said earlier about how to respond if you take a misstep. And I think one thing that's missing at the university is kind of a more a well thought through plan for handling a range of possible events and incidents. I mean, again, we have so many experts on campus that could help inform that conversation, but I think we need to get ahead of incidents that are almost certain to occur from now on by thinking through, for example, when is a restorative justice approach appropriate for certain circumstances? When is it not? What happened? How should we help people who are involved in a particular incident work things through so they can get to some kind of reconciliation, et cetera. And again, I think despite the fact that we have so much expertise, we've been somewhat slow to standardize and think through these processes.
Anybody else? Just jump in and react. Naomi.
Sure, I'd like to jump in quickly. And Kentaro, I think those are really important points. I'm going to go even maybe a little more pointed with some of mine, and that is, what do we need? I think we need a really strong tone and leadership in this. And we've got so much expertise here at the university, but I don't think we should have silence on this. We've had a lot of trauma happen from this in this university in various individual cases that are over 20 years old, and cases with our upper leadership. And we need to have the leadership that's now here reach out to us. I think Mary Sue Coleman's, and I remember when she was first president, I think her letters reaching out is helpful. I also want to hear from the provost, who I think is my connection to the president looks out to the donors and to everyone else, sets one tone, but I want to have other leadership saying, hey, we want this to be a place unlike the media area where you've got, wars that happen, where in classes, we've got 15 weeks of working things out and talking about stuff, where we have this place where I see there's a question in the comments about the cocoon of the university. If only it could be a cocoon. We want it to be a cocoon. I have gotten to the point where these students are now at the age where I could be their mom. I love these folks. I want to protect them. And I also need to squeeze them a little bit so they're like, oh, okay, let me learn this. So I think we need to be a place that is, we've got support and leadership from the top, all these wonderful resources at the University of Michigan. We need to not have them be so scattered, but to have somebody like a central office where we can go, or where that leadership reaches out to us to say, hey, I hear something's going on. How can I help you? What are the individual contours here?
What I hear you saying, Naomi, is that an atmosphere or a tone of either fear or acceptance and bravery and
care
is something that trickles down from the top. Yes. And if you don't have it at the top, it is all that much more difficult to create it at the departmental level. Other thoughts?
So I just want to, I think that's exactly right. I think that the tone of leadership is extremely important, and just to persuade our colleagues that this is part of serious faculty work, is being able to handle these kinds of issues well as they come along. The other, I had something and it just slipped out of my mind. If it comes back, I'll come back.
That's okay, but you did raise the issue of serious faculty work, and there's a question from Doug Ortiz. It says, how can we have confidence that faculty are trained to navigate difficult conversations? Are professors trained in relevant pedagogy to support inclusive dialogue and address harm? How do we know that all of our colleagues actually have the tools they need to navigate this in some of the excellent ways that you all have laid out here?
So
Can I
that's
just hop in
actually,
here.
Yeah,
Oh,
Whitney.
Well, what I want to say about the training, I think training is really important. And from the time that I was at the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching, which is a great resource on campus, I can certainly talk about all the ways that training is available, both through, orientation programs that are mandatory in some schools, through the voluntary seminar series that the center runs all year long, ways that the center is invited into different departments to run trainings. There's also great work going on in the school. So there are training opportunities, right? And there's a conversation about, should it all be mandatory, right? What's the value of a mandatory training? It certainly allows the university or the school or the department to say X number of people were exposed to X content. It doesn't necessarily ensure that X number of people are taking up and applying this particular kind of content. And so, mandatory training without, for me, the big thing here is always going to be accountability, structures of accountability. How are people held accountable? But the other thing is, even with training, so my doctoral training is in women's gender and sexuality studies. Let me be real clear. There are no neutral topics in women's gender and sexuality studies. You never walk into the classroom thinking, I'm going to talk about something that's apolitical or neutral. You are always prepared to navigate the clash, right, of people's beliefs and what they've been taught and what they hold deeply with what's happening in the classroom space. And so much of this is about having opportunities to practice. If you go to that one training, you need time to be able to develop your skill. And in the process, you will mess up. You will say the thing, you will assign something, you will think it's no big deal, and a student will say, flag on the play, it is the biggest deal. And in those moments, you have to have the structures of accountability. And I think, Kentaro, you said this before, and this connects to something, Naomi, that you said. This is really about having these things proactively. How do you set up in the beginning of a class, right? In the beginning of your relationship with a student, here's how I'm going to invite your feedback. Here's how I'm going to be prepared to act on it. I want to hear from you. I messed up in this moment. Let me tell you what I think I might have done here differently. And that is going to be scary. That is not going to fall out the same for differently situated faculty. Let me be clear, right? For BIPOC faculty, right? For marginalized, minoritized faculty to have that level of vulnerability in the classroom, that is scary. That's going to require, as Naomi has named, departmental support, leadership support for that kind of growth. But I think, we've got to provide training, but we really have to have a long form approach to this. People are building skills over time, and it's not necessarily strictly linear. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I still mess up, and I still have to apologize, and I still have to say that wasn't the right way to phrase that. That wasn't the right tool to use. But I think that kind of resilience work, so accountability and building restoration and resilience, I think is really what we need more of for our instructional community and our training community at the university.
The word accountability has come up several times during this conversation so far, and I'd love us to just take a second to share our thoughts about what accountability looks like. So often, I think when we hear the term accountability, people immediately think of accountability as a blunt instrument that you're wielding against someone as a punishment. What does accountability look like in this context to build more resilient, a more resilient community?
I'll throw this out and then I'll stop for someone else to hop in. Sonia Renee Taylor, who wrote the book, The Body is Not an Apology. If you've not seen it, if read it, it's a great book. But I was in a workshop with her once and she said, accountability without community is essentially surveillance and policing. And I think that is a really important part of accountability for me. It is not the blunt object. It is not the rapping on the knuckles, right? That
I feel like I need to snap on that one.
It has stuck with me. It was such a powerful thing when she said it, right? And what better place, right? A university is a great place with all of our rhetoric around community, intellectual community, all of these ways, right? Accountability is the ability to do what Loretta Ross says, is to call someone in, to say there may be a better way, right, to do that. There may be a different resource. Here, this is what harm looks like. I think Naomi's explanation of harm was beautiful, right? To really ask someone to think through, do you see harm here? Can you understand that? That's what accountability can look like. It can look like an invitation into a conversation and really sharing with someone resources for, here's a different way that you might do that. That's one way that accountability can look.
And I would love for someone else to jump in on the accountability question. Another phrase you just used, the difference between calling someone out and calling someone in. And in a community, sort of having more tools to call people in, I think is something that's been suggested here. Anyone else want to offer thoughts on accountability?
Quick thought. I think, so again, especially in this context of academic freedom, where the academy to some extent has room to define its own rules, it gives you a lot of opportunity and a lot of risk. The accountability is the ability to describe what you're doing and why, and how you know that it works or it doesn't, but being able to describe richly for various populations what you're up to and why. That's I'll leave it there.
I like both of those in terms of what you're up to and why for accountability, but also especially this idea of being in community and that we are not hung out to dry. And when harm does happen, as it will happen, if anything, this is a university, a space, it's kind of good to help when people are discomforted. I'm not saying that everybody has to do harm, and we try to minimize the harm. Believe me, I'm not trying to say everybody does harm willy-nilly, no. But the point is that when it happens, it's moving on and you can't just ignore it. You've got to give the support to say, oh my gosh, I got to learn from this. I didn't even realize something was wrong, or, oh, I was a little weirded out about that, but I thought it was okay because that's how it was when I was taught. One of the really tough things for faculty, I don't know if it's this way for junior faculty, but for senior faculty, I don't want to say we were beat up a lot, but there's so much understanding now about how to do things in a more inclusive way. And so we get to learn this. We are experts in certain things, but perhaps it's a really great model that as smart as we are, we're still human, believe it or not. And there's still so many things that we need people being gentle with us on how to learn it. And we need to be gentle with our students and our less seasoned colleagues on how to learn. So this community element really feels helpful to me.
Sean, I see a lot of head shaking from your square.
Yeah, I think there's also a lot about emphasizing community over sort of wrapping on the knuckles accountability in sort of reducing our fear and anxiety about talking about difficult concepts in the classroom, because, you know, people are going to screw up. It's going to happen. Even with the best possible training, that if every faculty member received it, norms and standards change over time and people make mistakes. But if we sort of check our egos at the door, and instead of being embarrassed and distraught about it, have conversations with our colleagues and students about how to do better, we can make those mistakes productive instead of just fearing them and shying away from topics as a result.
And a lot of the word fear comes up a lot in these conversations. And we've been talking a lot so far about faculty, but there's a question from Jack Bernard in the Q&A box. And I would encourage everybody who's joined us today, please submit your questions in the Q&A box. We're following them. But Jack asks, I've noticed that students are increasingly concerned about taking positions or asking questions that could be understood to be offensive. Their internal dialogue has them weighing their curiosity and thoughts against suffering the opprobrium of their colleagues. How can faculty help students navigate these waters? It's a great question. Who'd like to jump in?
I think we model behavior in very instructive ways. And so for a student who's sort of learning all of these sort of ideas and they're exposed to things for the first time, it's good. And our students are smart. They realize, okay, let me see what's going on. Let me see sort of how to do this, in which case it's our responsibility in the classroom to try to model, well, here are opposing views and how to present them with sensitivity and not just sort of write them off, so that a student could learn how, if they have a feeling that feels really uncomfortable, to say, well, how about this? So rather than putting yourself on the line, to say, you know, here's another view I've thought of, if that makes some sense. Like we can help model how to make the classroom a space for lots of views, unpopular views, views that are still developing, but we want it to be in a respectful way that we can get to the rigor of the conversation, but also have the care so that what is said is not taken to minimize anybody else's position and identity.
You know, one of the things that I've been listening to this conversation with great interest, because we're talking about academic freedom here today, but in my world, journalism, we have a lot of these conversations related to press freedom and engagement and questioning of, in the same way that institutions like higher education are being questioned, the role of journalism in a democratic society is also being questioned. And I think one of the things that comes up often for us, and one of the things we talk about at Wallace House, is the need for transparency, and to let the consumers of journalism know how do journalists do their work? How do you report? How do you follow facts? How do you track data? Is this a conversation that happens in the academy and among faculty? So we're talking about training faculty to be able to better engage in the classroom. Are students ever given transparency to that process, to see how you're trained, how you develop your pedagogy, and what you're struggling with to create a good experience for them?
I would say that happens without planning as such. So some faculty share with some students that kind of internal logic. I think it's actually a wonderful idea. But I would also say I think it's unusual in that there's no basic mechanism. I mean, it'd be interesting to talk with the people at CRLT about whether, you know, what that might look like, who would be good to try it with. But I don't think that there's anything general unless things have changed in the couple of years since I stopped teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to say that we're talking about a university with such vast amounts of knowledge and different types of things. So it's easy for me to say, listen to this aria, and what are two different responses that you can have to, you know, is this character angry or is this character betrayed? There's room for a vast interpretation sometimes. Whereas if you're trying to teach somebody how to make a dental bridge, there are certain things that need to be like, you need to put this in this way. So there's certain disciplines where they're not that there's never an interpretation, because usually there's the art and the interpretation overseeing the larger thing, but it's not as though everything is always relative. So I just wanted to put that out there,
Yeah.
that there is still, and you know, as faculty, it's not easy to become a faculty member here at Michigan, and there's a really rigorous process, and there needs to be a little more, or I don't think more, because usually I haven't had too much trouble, but there needs to be trust that we are here for a reason and we know what we're doing, but sometimes there are real absolutes that need to be upheld.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to make sure we're getting the questions from the Q&A chat here. Joshua asks, how can we ensure that students feel empowered to be brave and to ask important questions, to challenge perspectives raised, and hence bring diversity of thought to discussions at the university? Kentaro?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a direct answer to that question, but one thing that you know, several of the comments have reminded me of is that a lot of difficult conversations and difficult situations are much easier managed if you already have a good relationship with the people who are involved. I recently had a conversation which, if I had with somebody I didn't know well recently, a former student, it could easily have gone off the rails and I would have been, the one in trouble without doubt. But because it was somebody who, with whom I had a very strong relationship of trust, we were able to go beyond the margins of what might have been, a reasonable conversation in other contexts. And I think this is, particularly difficult under the pandemic because it's really hard to build new relationships with people we don't already know. But I do think that that's it hasn't come up too much in our conversation so far. But my guess is, most of us would agree that having a relationship with somebody that is based on trust and mutual trust and concern that exists independent of the topic of discussion gives us a lot more kind of space to have a lot of these challenging discussions.
Yeah, I think, Kentaro, goes back to this notion that we talked about in the beginning of feeling like you have a community in a room that you can set the norms for, and that's much more difficult when you're remote, I think. Paul, did I just see you raise your hand?
Nope, just scratching my head.
Okay, you have the freedom to do that. Does somebody want to address directly this question of ensuring that we are empowering students? Whitney?
Yeah, I would like to say this is a place where I think really seeking out some of the resources that are on campus. So at the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching, the really amazing folks that work in the DEI area talk a lot about what we call structured interactions. So creating, structuring opportunities for students to be able to provide feedback. And there are a range of ways that you can do that. You can do that through note cards or Google Forms, quick check-ins with students. You can do that through midterm surveys with students and a service they offer at CRLT called a mid-semester feedback, right? So there are lots of ways, I think, but actively inviting students in, Sean, I think, noted this earlier, the bravery that it takes for a student to say something's wrong, right? And imagine if a student has to figure out when's the right moment, and do I say it in class? Do I go to the office hour? Do I send it as an email? Do I need to take 5 people with me? But if there is some sort of opportunity that they can just plug right into and share that feedback and hear from you, I think that's an important way. The other way I want to say, and this may be taking us a little bit afield, but I want to make a plug for normalizing emotion in the classroom space. Darrell Sue, who's best known for his work on microaggressions, has some work around kind of race dialogue and race talk and what it means to talk about race in classrooms. And he talks about the academic protocol, which draws on this, for me, really kind of empty and limited notion of objectivity, that when we step into the classroom space as knowers and scholars and thinkers, we shed all of our feelings and identities, right? And we walk in as these kind of objective academics or objective scholars. And I think also helping students to really think about the role of emotion, that something can make you angry, it can make you sad, it can upset you, right? It can leave you feeling a little bit muddled, like, I don't know what this is that I'm feeling, but it's not good. It can make you really happy or joyful, and that's a critical part of scholarship. I think even just normalizing that for students is a way to, is an avenue towards empowerment, right? That their responses in the classroom space are okay, that it's okay for them to have a range of responses, and then offering them an avenue to think those through or share those with you or with their colleagues.
Mm-hmm. I want to, ask, because we've mentioned a few books as we've been talking, and I know none of us who are speaking right now have the time to be putting these in the chat, but I'm certain that the people who have joined us today would love these resources. And so maybe we can collect the resources that have been mentioned and have them sent to all the people who registered after the conversation, so that people have some ways to engage and move some of this conversation forward after we're done. I know I would like to read some of the things that have been mentioned today. And I'm gonna give 2 questions that are in the Q&A as a 2-parter. They're different but linked. One person just asserts that maybe students don't have academic freedom, and it seems like undergraduates don't have much academic freedom. Is it part and parcel of inclusion to extend academic freedom to students? And then someone else put in the Q&A, centering one new thing or another can result in intended or unintended, the seeming decentering of another thing. And so how do we build a larger center that can include more ideas? And I think with this, how do we create a student's space for students to feel like they also have academic freedom? Naomi, I saw you shaking your head. So maybe I'll ask you to jump in.
Sure, I'll jump in quickly because I want other folks to be able to also. So do students have academic freedom? I don't understand that question, and maybe it has to do with different disciplines or types of, I think students have a lot of academic freedom. They can agree with something, they can disagree, we ask them, we hold them to the standards of please don't plagiarize, let us know what your sources are. But I think I'm missing something. So if somebody understands that, please help me understand.
Yeah, I think that the question was sort of, as I read it, at least suggesting that maybe students don't feel they have as much freedom as it would seem.
So I think, I mean, I'm with Naomi here. Students do have academic freedom, and we count on that. One thing I always tell my students is, if there's something that you don't understand or are puzzled by, there's 15 other people here who also don't understand it and are puzzled by it. So this would be a good time to bring it up, and we can figure out what we can learn from it. But if we define academic freedom, as I suggested, as the freedom to be able to do what the academy does, having students have ideas and share them with us, and with a great deal of flexibility, is just part and parcel of that.
Mm-hmm. There's a question in the chat here about leadership and messages from leadership, and when a message comes down from a university on high, whether it can unintentionally have the effect of squelching dialogue, and is there, and at the end of this question it says, how are students empowered to be brave enough to shine a light on the chasm between virtue signaling and incongruous actions? And I think the implied end of this sentence is among leadership. Paul, I think I'm going to give this one to you since you've been in university leadership and may have heard questions similar to this.
This really is the place where you try to turn an idea into a norm, into a change in the community, right? This is, so having the president or the provost say something doesn't get you very far. Whoever asked the question, the notion that by putting something in the spotlight, something else may be coming out of it, that's absolutely true. That does happen. And so you have to repeatedly be saying, not just at that highest level, but the highest level has to be helping all of the other levels to say, we want and we expect people to be raising ideas, especially if they're troubled by something that we're doing, right? That's exactly the time that you absolutely are empowered under the way this community works to say what's on your mind. And like many other things that are worth saying, that's worth saying that one over and over and over again.
Yeah, I want to be mindful of time because we have some wrap-up comments from Rob Sellers at the end, but there's an interesting question here in the Q&A that says, what norms from outside the Midwest or the United States would you most like to see become more embedded in our teaching at the University of Michigan and in learning settings broadly? So from where do you draw your inspiration? And are there places that you all are looking to that do things in a very different way that we might want to think about for our community here? Whitney, I think I saw you with a head shake. So I'm just taking the liberty of calling on you here.
Now I feel like Kentaro earlier,
Yes.
just throwing this in there. You know, when I thought about this, the main thing I think about is someone who's from the Southern United States and coming to Michigan to take a job at the university. And I think there are ways as someone who's from the Southern US, from Texas, educated primarily in Georgia, that there were certain kinds of conversations that you just couldn't skirt. There's something that I've learned to navigate living in Michigan around Midwestern nice. And sort of moving around certain kinds of things, sidestepping conversations. Where I'm from, there are things around race that you can't step over them if you really wanted to. And so I think moving away from that culture of avoidance, moving away from that pedagogy of fear and that pedagogy of avoidance would be, I think, a really important tool for the university and for instructors.
Mm-hmm. Kentaro, since we talked about me putting you on the spot earlier, I'll do it again. Are there concepts from looking at other parts of the country, other institutions, other ways of doing things that you think could be instructive to us here?
I mean, I think, again, we're a large university, so we see versions of, every culture in it somewhere. But one thing that I think, first of all, I'll say, I'm Japanese and coming from a culture outside the United States. One thing I really love about the university and about the United States is just how willing people are to speak their mind. I mean, that is part of academic freedom. It's important. I mean, without that, the ideas don't come out. I think the flip side is that we could be better as a community at valuing consensus on at least those things that we can reach consensus on. I think sometimes we're quite happy with, okay, let's agree to disagree, instead of really trying to do the work to see what where the consensus is and where the differences might be. And I think that would shrink, the space in which there is very strong disagreement. And I would say there are cultures where, that consensus is overvalued, but where I think it could be a corrective force in the United States.
And certainly that work to build consensus is what helps to create community norms, right? And norms for engagement. You have to work to build some consensus to have a community engage around a set of norms. Sean, before we wrap, I'd love to hear your thoughts on any places that you draw inspiration from, and any resources that we should look to as we're thinking about doing a better job of this in our community.
I guess going back to the previous question about do messages from the top of the administration stifle academic speech? And I can understand the question, but I think the answer is just go to a faculty senate meeting and you'll see that it doesn't. We do have a lot of freedoms and we should value and protect them, but also appreciate what we have. The second point on that about virtue signaling, it's often talked about negatively, but I think to the people who are on the receiving end of that virtue signaling, it can be very valuable, but mostly when it's backed up by action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think virtue signaling is one of these terms that there are a number of terms that have been developed and popularized in recent years that have actually been turned on their heads in a way to kind of diminish the intent behind the word. And if virtue signaling is typically used to enter sort of a tone of snark to a conversation, virtue is not something that should generate snark, right? That it should be something that we're striving for. And if we're signaling that we have an intent to create a virtuous space in the way we communicate with one another, I agree that that's something that we shouldn't diminish and that we should make room for. This conversation was so interesting. I so appreciate your perspectives and your expertise. And I should just say, for anyone who didn't pick this up, your level of engagement with this. Sometimes people talk about ideas and you can tell they're not necessarily engaged in the work. it is very clear to me that all of you are deeply engaged in the work of the concepts that we've been talking about today. And I think it's inspiring and should make everyone feel that they also want to be engaged in this work. And so I'm hoping that we can extend this beyond just this conversation today and move from this discussion to create some resources that people can access. Questions that we didn't get to today, if they're in the chat, we'll find some way to answer them and get answers back to you, and that you can reach out to us. And for people who want to continue this and explore it in your areas at the university and beyond, that I think this is an important conversation, and your input today was just so valuable. I learned a great deal. And I want to turn, for our closing, I want to turn things over to Rob Sellers, Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Chief Diversity Officer for the university, who lives and breathes and works in this space with great commitment. Thank you for inviting me, Rob, to participate in this conversation today, and I'll leave things with you.
Well, first and foremost, I want to thank you, Lynette, for a masterful job as the moderator of this wonderful, amazing, engaged, and thoughtful panel. So I want to thank both you and our panelists for today's event. I also want to just take a quick moment to share a couple of comments and thoughts that I had listening to the panel. One of the things that came from the panel was really 3 words jumped out at me. The first is this notion of all of us being a part of a larger community. So as we think about issues of academic freedom and think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, these are all fundamental values, but they're values in service of a larger community, a community of scholars, a community of innovation, a community that is really primarily brought together to develop new knowledge and then transfer that throughout to other generations and other students. And with that also comes the second piece, and that's responsibility. That as members of the community, we have a responsibility that goes beyond a responsibility to ourselves. So with academic freedom, with the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, these are fundamentally relational constructs that is all about how we engage not only ourselves, but more importantly, how does it serve the larger academic community? And then the last thing that, last set of ideas that are really takeaways for me, really focuses on the notion of training, particularly in the context of academic freedom, that as part of this larger community with a set of responsibilities, with these relationships, we also have a set of obligations around making sure that we are able to do our job. And our job is to engage in teaching and learning. And that doesn't just happen. And teaching and learning should not be harmful, but it is definitely volatile. And we have to, as a community, understand that distinction and make sure we do everything that we can to do no harm, while at the same point in time recognize that there are going to be points in which there's going to be volatility. And if there is no volatility, there's no new knowledge gained. The production of knowledge in and of itself is. And so this conversation is a difficult conversation that needs to happen not only here at the University of Michigan, but is one that needs to happen throughout higher education. And I'm very happy that we were able to begin this conversation. This can't be the end. this needs to be the start of multiple conversations throughout the university community as we look to develop the kind of community that we are all striving for. And as we do so, it's important for us to understand that we're not at the end, we're really at the beginning as we think about what a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive university should look like and how academic freedom should manifest itself in that particular space. So with that, again, I want to thank our wonderful panel. I want to thank Lynette for moderating. I want to definitely thank you all for attending. And last but not least, I want to thank the wonderful staff at NCID and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as our wonderful co-sponsors of this event. And I encourage you to continue the conversation outside of here. We will continue to bring opportunities for conversations like this into the future. So I wish you all a wonderful spring break as it comes up and a safe and happy respite. Thank you.